Welcome back, YouTubers. Today we're going to go over chapter 28 of the Turner Diaries. Hold on to your seats, folks. November 9, 1994. It's still 3 hours until first light, and all systems are go. I'll use the time to write a few pages. My last diary entry. Then it's a one-way trip to the Pentagon for me. The warhead is strapped into the front seat of the old Stearman and rigged to detonate either on impact or when I flip a switch in the back seat. Hopefully, I'll be able to manage a low-level airburst directly over the center of the Pentagon. Failing that, I'll at least try to fly as close as I can before I'm shot down. It's been more than 4 years since I've flown, but I've thoroughly familiarized myself with the Stearman cockpit and been briefed on the plane's peculiarities. I don't anticipate any piloting problems. The barn hangar here is only 8 miles from the Pentagon. We'll thoroughly warm up the engine in the barn, and when the door is opened, I'll go like a bat out of hell, straight for the Pentagon, at an altitude of about 50 feet. By the time I hit the defensive perimeter, I should be making about 150 miles an hour, and it'll take me just under 70 seconds to reach the target. 2/3 of the troops around the Pentagon are niggers, which should greatly boost my chances of getting through. The sky should still be heavily overcast, and there will be just enough light for me to make out my landmarks. We've painted the plane to be as nearly invisible as possible under the anticipated flying conditions, and I'll be too low for radar-controlled fire. Considering everything, I believe my chances are excellent. I regret that I won't be around to participate in the final success of our revolution, but I am happy that I have been allowed to do as much as I have. It is a comforting thought in these last hours of my physical existence that, of all the billions of men and women of my race who have ever lived, I will have been able to play a more vital role than all but a handful of them in determining the ultimate destiny of mankind. What I will do today will be of more weight in the annals of the race than all conquests of Caesar and Napoleon, if I succeed. And succeed I must, or the entire revolution will be in the gravest danger. Revolutionary Command estimates that the system will launch its invasion against California within the next 48 hours, once the order is issued from the Pentagon. We will be unable to halt the invasion, and if my mission today fails, there will not be enough time for us to try something else. Monday night, after we had made the final decision on this mission, I underwent the rite of the Union. Actually, I have been undergoing the rite for the past 30 hours, and it will not be complete for another 3. Only in the moment of my death will I achieve full membership in the order. To many, that may seem a gloomy prospect. I suppose, but not to me. I have known what was ahead of me since my trial last March, and I am grateful that my probationary period has been cut short by 5 months. Partly because of the present crisis and partly because my performance since March has been considered exemplary. The ceremony Monday was more moving and beautiful than I could have imagined it would be. More than 200 of us assembled in the cellar of the Georgetown gift shop, from which the partitions and stacked crates had been removed to make room for us. 30 new probationary members were sworn into the order, and 18 others, including me, participated in the rite of union. I alone, however, was singled out because of my unique status. When Major Williams summoned me, I stepped forward and then turned to face the silent sea of robed figures. What a contrast with the tiny gathering only 2 years earlier, when 7 of us met upstairs for my initiation. The order, even with its extraordinary standards, is growing with astonishing rapidity. Knowing fully what was demanded in character and commitment of each man who stood before me, my chest swelled with pride. These were no soft-bellied conservative businessmen assembled for some Masonic mumbo-jumbo, no loud-mouthed, beery rednecks letting off a little ritualized steam about the goddamn niggers, no pious, frightened churchgoers whining for the guidance or protection of an anthropomorphic deity. These were real men, white men, men who were now one with me in spirit and consciousness, as well as in blood. As the torchlight flickered over the coarse, gray robes of motionless throng, I thought to myself, these men are the best my race has produced in this generation, and they are as good as have been produced in any generation. In them are combined fiery passion and icy discipline, deep intelligence and instant readiness for action, a strong sense of self-worth, and a total commitment to our common cause. On them hang the hopes of everything that will ever be. They are the vanguard of the coming new era, the pioneers who will lead our race out of its present depths and toward the unexplored heights above. And I am one with them. Then I made my brief declaration. Brothers, 2 years ago, when I entered your ranks for the first time, I consecrated my life to our order and to the purpose for which it exists. But then I faltered in the fulfillment of my obligation to you. Now I am ready to meet my obligation fully. I offer you my life. Do you accept it? In a rumbling unison, the reply came back, Brother, we accept your life. In return, we offer you everlasting life in us. Your deed shall not be in vain, nor shall it be forgotten, until the end of time. To this commitment we pledge our lives. I know as certainly as it is possible for a man to know anything, that the order will not fail me, if I do not fail. The order has a life which is more than the sum of the lives of its members. When it speaks collectively, as it did Monday, something deeper and older and wiser than any of us speaks, something which cannot die. Of that deeper life I am now about to partake. Of course, I would have liked to have had children by Catherine, so that I could have immortality of another sort, but that is not to be. I am satisfied. They've been warming up the engine for about 10 minutes now, and Bill is signaling to me that it's time to go. The rest of the crew has already taken cover in the blast shelter we dug under the barn floor. I will now entrust my diary to Bill, and he will later put it in the hiding place with the other volumes. Epilogue. Thus end Earl Turner's diaries, as unpretentiously as they began. His final mission was successful, of course, as we all are reminded each year on November 9, our traditional day of the martyrs. With the system's principal military nerve center destroyed, the system's forces poised outside the organization's California enclave continued to wait for orders, which never came. Declining morale, soaring desertions, growing black indiscipline, and finally, the inability of the system to maintain the integrity of its supply line to its California troops resulted in the gradual erosion of the threat of invasion. Eventually, the system began regrouping its forces elsewhere to meet new challenges in other parts of the country. And then, just as the Jews had feared, the flow of organization activists turned exactly 180 degrees from what it had been in the weeks and months immediately prior to July 4, 1994. From scores of training camps in the liberated zone, first hundreds, then thousands of highly motivated guerrilla fighters began slipping through the system's diminishing ring of troops and moving eastward. With these guerrilla forces, the organization followed the example of its Baltimore members and rapidly established dozens of new enclaves, primarily in the nuclear devastated areas where system authority was weakest. The Detroit enclave was initially the most important of these. Bloody anarchy had reigned among the survivors in the Detroit area for several weeks after the nuclear blast of September 8. Eventually, a semblance of order had been restored, with the system troops loosely sharing power with the leaders of a number of black gangs in the area. Although there were a few isolated white strongholds which kept the roving mob of black plunderers and rapists at bay, most of the disorganized and demoralized white survivors in and around Detroit offered no effective resistance to the blacks. And just as in other heavily black areas of the country, they suffered terribly. Then, in mid-December, the organization seized the initiative. A number of synchronized lightning raids on the system's military strongpoints in the Detroit area resulted in an easy victory. The organization then established certain patterns in Detroit which were soon followed elsewhere. All captured white troops, as soon as they had laid down their weapons, were offered a chance to fight with the organization against the system. Those who immediately volunteered were taken aside for preliminary screening and then sent to camps for indoctrination and special training. The others were machine-gunned on the spot without further ado. The same degree of ruthlessness was used in dealing with the white civilian population. When the organization's cadre moved into the white strongholds in the Detroit suburbs, the first thing they found it necessary to do was to liquidate most of the local white leaders in order to establish the unquestioned authority of the organization. There was no time or patience for trying to reason with short-sighted whites who insisted that they weren't racists or revolutionaries and didn't need the help of any outside agitators in dealing with their problems, or who had some other conservative or parochial fixation. The whites of Detroit and the other new enclaves were organized more along the lines described by Earl Turner for Baltimore than for California, but even more rapidly and thoroughly. In most areas of the country, there was no opportunity for an orderly, large-scale separation of non-whites, as in California, and consequently, a bloody race war raged for months, taking a terrible toll on those whites who were not in one of the organization's tightly controlled all-white enclaves. Food became critically scarce everywhere during the winter of 94 to 95. The blacks lapsed into cannibalism just as they had in California, while hundreds of thousands of starving whites who earlier had ignored the organization's call for a rising against the system began appearing at the borders of the various liberated zones, begging for food. The organization was only able to feed the white populations already under its control by imposing the severest rationing, and it was necessary to turn many of the latecomers away. Those who were admitted, and that meant only children, women of childbearing age, and able-bodied men willing to fight in the organization's ranks were subjected to much more severe racial screening than had been used to separate whites from non-whites in California. It was no longer sufficient to be merely white. In order to eat, one had to be judged the bearer of especially valuable genes. In Detroit, the practice was first established, and it was later adopted elsewhere, of providing any able-bodied white male who sought admittance to the organization's enclave with one hot meal and a bayonet or other edged weapon. His forehead was then marked with an indelible dye, and he was turned out and could be readmitted permanently only by bringing back the head of a freshly killed black or other non-white. This practice assured that precious food would not be wasted on those who would not or could not add to the organization's fighting strength, but it took a terrible toll of the weaker and more decadent white elements. Tens of millions perished during the first half of 1995, and the total white population of the country reached a low point of approximately 50 million by August of that year. By then, however, nearly half the remaining whites were in organization enclaves, and food production and distribution in the enclaves had grown until it was barely sufficient to prevent further losses from starvation. Although a central government of sorts still existed, the system's military and police forces were, for all practical purposes, reduced to a number of essentially autonomous local commands, whose principal activity became looting for food, liquor, gasoline, and women. Both the organization and the system avoided large-scale encounters with each other, the organization confining itself to short, intense raids on system troop concentrations and other facilities, and the system forces confining themselves to guarding their sources of supply, in some areas to attempting to limit the further expansion of the organization's enclaves. But the organization's enclaves continued to expand nevertheless, both in size and number. All through the 5 dark years preceding the new era, at one time there were nearly 2,000 separate organization enclaves in North America. Outside these zones of order and security, the anarchy and savagery grew steadily worse, with the only real authority wielded by marauding bands which preyed on each other and on the unorganized and defenseless masses. Many of these bands were composed of blacks, Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, and half-white mongrels. In growing numbers, however, whites also formed bands along racial lines, even without organization guidance. As the war of extermination wore on, millions of soft, city-bred, brainwashed whites gradually began regaining their manhood. The rest died. The organization's growing success was not without its setbacks, of course. One of the most notable of these was the terrible Pittsburgh Massacre of June 1995. The organization had established an enclave there in May of that year, forcing the retreat of local system forces, but it did not act swiftly enough in identifying and liquidating the local Jewish element. A number of Jews, in collaboration with white conservatives and liberals, had time to work out a plan of subversion. The consequence was that system troops, aided by their fifth column inside the enclave, recaptured Pittsburgh. The Jews and blacks then went on a wild rampage of mass murder, reminiscent of the worst excesses of the Jew-instigated Bolshevik Revolution in Russia 75 years earlier. By the time the blood orgy ended, virtually every white in the area had either been butchered or forced to flee. The surviving staff members of the organization's Pittsburgh Field Command, whose hesitation in dealing with the Jews had brought on the catastrophe, were rounded up and shot by a special disciplinary squad acting on orders from Revolutionary Command. The only time after November 9, 1994, the organization was forced to detonate a nuclear weapon on the North American continent was a year later in Toronto. Hundreds of thousands of Jews had fled the United States to the Canadian city during the 1994 and 1995, making almost a second New York of it, and using it as their command center for the war raging to the south. So far as both the Jews and the organization were concerned, the U.S.-Canadian border had no real significance during the later stages of the Great Revolution, and by mid-1995, conditions were only slightly less chaotic north of the border than south of it. Throughout the dark years, neither the organization nor the system could hope for a completely decisive advantage over the other, so long as they both retained the capability for nuclear warfare. During the first part of this period, when the system's conventional military strength greatly exceeded the organization's, only the organization's threat of retaliation with its more than 100 nuclear warheads hidden inside the major population centers, still under system control, kept the system, in most cases, from moving against the organization's liberated zones. Later, when organizational gains, together with growing attrition of the system's forces through desertions, tilted the balance of conventional strength toward the organization, the system retained control over a number of military units armed with nuclear weapons, and, by threatening to use these, forced the organization to leave certain system strongholds inviolate. Even the system's elite, pampered nuclear troops were not immune to the process of attrition, which sapped the system's conventional strength. However, they could postpone the inevitable only temporarily. On January 30, 2000, in the momentous Truce of Omaha, the last group of system generals surrendered their commands to the organization. In return for a pledge that they and their immediate families would be allowed to live out the remainders of their lives unmolested. The organization kept its pledge, and a special reservation on an island off the California coast was set aside for the generals. Then, of course, came the mopping up period, when the last of the non-white bands were hunted down and exterminated, followed by the final purge of undesirable racial elements among the remaining white population. From the liberation of North America until the beginning of the new era for our whole planet, there elapsed the remarkable short time of just under 11 months. Professor Anderson was recorded and analyzed the events of the climactic period in detail in his History of the Great Revolution. Here it is sufficient to note that the principal centers of the world Jewish power annihilated and the nuclear threat of the Soviet Union neutralized, the most important obstacles to the organization's worldwide victory were out of the way. From as early as 1994, the organization had active cells in Western Europe, and they grew with extraordinary rapidity in the 6 years preceding the victory in North America. Liberalism had taken its toll in Europe, just as in America, and the old order in most places was a rotted-out shell with only a surface semblance of strength. The disastrous economic collapse in Europe in the spring of 2000, following the demise of the system in North America, greatly helped in preparing the European masses morally for the organization's final takeover. That takeover came in a great Europe-wide rush in the summer and fall of 2000. As a cleansing hurricane of change swept over the continent, clearing away in a few months the refuse of a millennium or more of alien ideology, and a century or more of profound moral and material decadence. The blood flowed ankle deep in the streets of many European great cities momentarily, as the race traders, the offspring of generations of dysgenic breeding and hordes of gastrobiter, met a common fate. Then the great dawn of the new era broke over the Western world. The single remaining power center on Earth, not under organization control by early December 2000, was China. The organization was willing to postpone the solution of the Chinese problem for several years, but the Chinese themselves forced the organization to take immediate and drastic action. The Chinese, of course, had invaded the Asiatic regions of the Soviet Union immediately after the nuclear strike of September 8, 1994. But until the fall of 2000, they had remained east of the Urals, consolidating the vast new conquered territory. When during the summer and early fall of 2000, one European nation after another was liberated by the organization, the Chinese decided to make a grab for European Russia. The organization countered this move massively, using nuclear missiles to knock out the still primitive Chinese missile and strategic bomber capabilities, as well as hitting a number of new Chinese troop concentrations west of the Urals. Unfortunately, this action did not stem the yellow tide flowing north and west from China. The organization still required time to reorganize and reorient the European populations newly under its control before it could hope to deal in a conventional manner with the enormous numbers of Chinese infantry pouring across the Urals into Europe. All its dependable troops at the time were hardly sufficient even for garrison duty in the newly liberated and still not entirely pacified areas of Eastern and Southern Europe. Therefore, the organization resorted to a combination of chemical, biological, and radiological means on an enormous scale to deal with the problem. Over a period of 4 years, some 16 million square miles of the Earth's surface, from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific and from the Arctic Ocean to the Indian Ocean, were effectively sterilized. Thus was the Great Eastern Waste created. Only in the last decade have certain areas of the waste been declared safe for colonization. Even so, they are safe only in the sense that the poisons sowed there a century ago have abated to the point that they are no longer a hazard to life. As everyone is aware, the bands of mutants which roam the waste remain a real threat, and it may be another century before the last of them has been eliminated, and white colonization has once again established a human presence throughout this vast area. But it was in the year 2000, according to the chronology of the old era, just 110 years after the birth of the Great One, that the dream of a white world finally became a certainty. And it was the sacrifice of the lives of uncounted thousands of brave men and women of the organization during the preceding years which had kept that dream alive until its realization could no longer be denied. Among these uncounted thousands, Earl Turner played no small part. He gained immortality for himself on the dark November day, 106 years ago, when he faithfully fulfilled his obligation to his race, to the organization, and to the Holy Order which had accepted him into its ranks. And in so doing, he helped greatly to assure that his race would survive and prosper, that the organization would achieve its worldwide political and military goals, and that the order would spread its wise and benevolent rule over the earth for all time to come. And that is the end of the Turner Diaries. I appreciate y'all coming along for this ride. Come back tonight and we'll do the breakdown, and that'll be it for the Turner Diaries, and we can finally move on to another book. Check you YouTubers out later.